Hi, Michelle, and thanks for joining me today. And I appreciate you taking the time to talk with people about the things that you do, because I think this could be really helpful for people. So why don't you take a minute, just introduce yourself and your firm and sort of what you do and what you specialize in.
Well, thank you, Sue, for inviting me. I really appreciate this opportunity to educate people. I am a trust and estate attorney. Have been so for several decades. I am a CPA by training, and I have a master's in tax. My firm is the law offices of Michelle Wright, and I have an associate attorney and two paralegals that work with me in this arena.
Okay.
We limit the practice to trusts and estates, and that can be very broad based depending upon the client that comes in and what their needs may be. We look at asset type and help them craft a plan for their family, for their assets, and hopefully minimize the interaction of the court and the costs associated with that
Yeah.
for the beneficiaries.
Okay. Yeah. And as you said, like, because it is so broad, I thought today, since we are a property management company and a lot of the landlords that we serve often have questions about, when you're purchasing a property, how do you take title and things like that. So I thought we could just kind of like sort of hone in on the rental side of things and how that would work in relation to what you do. So I guess the first area is, let's just talk a little bit about trusts, wills, LLC. How do you take title? Each of those, as
Yeah.
in my experience, I know there's a lot of information, a lot of misinformation out there. And I just want to be clear as to what each of those things mean and how they play a part in somebody in purchasing a property.
Sure. Well, first of all, I have to say, as every attorney has to say, this is for educational purposes only. And if you have a specific situation, you need to hire appropriate counsel and professionals to assist you in that. Real estate is one of the single largest assets we have in a portfolio. It doesn't get up and walk away. It doesn't appreciate often like stocks or bonds or portfolios for retirements. It's real estate, it's dirt, and it is dependent and governed by the laws of the state in which it is existing. So if you own property in West Virginia, you own property in Pennsylvania, you own property in New York, we have to look to the laws of that jurisdiction. But owning real estate can mean it's your home. It can mean it's rental property. And my biggest concern when I do planning for people is, how is it owned? Who are the owners of record? What is the purpose behind the real estate? Is it rental property? If it's rental property, I have concern about mitigating any kind of liability that may be coming to the owners, such as somebody suing them for slip and fall. So when we look at real estate, I start trying to do some basic asset protection for them. And the first order of business is, do you have an umbrella policy? Do you have a liability policy on this?
Yeah.
I like to have that increased so that we have an ability to possibly shift the risk for any kind of liability from a slip and fall or that kind of a personal injury situation on the property.
Right.
Then we look to, well, how do you want to own this? You may have purchased it or may be involved in purchasing it. How do you want to own it? Do you want to own it outright in your name? And if that is the case, how do we insulate your other assets from
Right.
any kind of a lawsuit? So the thing that I like to do and is relatively easy is to put it in an LLC.
Mhm.
Now, an LLC is a hybrid document. I mean, a hybrid entity. It is not a corporation, but it gives you the protection of a corporation. And it's not a partnership, but it is a flow through entity. So if you have two investors in an LLC that want to manage this property, and usually it's husband and wife, it is disregarded for tax purposes in that you don't pay a tax at the LLC level.
Mhm.
The income or loss flows through to the individual owners.
Right.
Now, what the LLC does is it allows the entity to own the real estate, and anything that comes out of that real estate is contained to that LLC.
Right.
It is an easy tool to use for managing and tracking income and expenses. So the LLC has to have a business purpose. Rental real estate is the primary. The thing that we see often that causes it to fail is there's no other assets in there, so that if you have a loss of a tenant, you're going to scramble to find money to pay for the mortgage that's on the property.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. Let me ask you this about LLC, since we're talking about this, because I know when you purchase it, and most people cannot purchase it, the property in the LLC. They're purchasing it in their own name. They have a mortgage.
Right.
You can go back later and retitle that in LLC, but really that's against your mortgage agreement. Is that correct? I mean,
Yes.
technically that's
Technically, that's a transfer of ownership, and every mortgage
correct.
has a due on sale clause. So what
Right.
we do is, if we are at the front end of the transaction, we work with the lender to
Mhm.
get permission. If we're at the back end of the transaction, we have to go back and ask permission.
Okay. 'Cause-
Otherwise, they will accelerate the mortgage and you have to go through a refinancing.
right.
The same issue comes up with regard to the insurance on the property. You need to get a insurance company that will recognize the LLC as the entity and insure it appropriately. Not every insurance company will allow that. Not every lender will allow this. So
Right.
it is good at the get-go to get this set up properly. If we're coming in at the back end, we need to get the permissions, and that's two-step process. Oftentimes, what the lender is concerned about in that kind of a transfer is, are the parties that they lent the money to the same?
Mhm.
So usually it's a husband and wife situation. They both qualified for the mortgage. The property being transferred in is not a problem, because there's really no effective ownership change other than the LLC. The lender still has the same security in terms of the underlying real estate. So it's not like we've diminished their security,
Right.
and so on. So
if somebody has multiple, I'm sorry to interrupt you. If they have, if somebody has a single property, then okay, that's fine. If that's what they choose and put an LLC. If they have multiple properties, would you recommend multiple LLCs, or do you put all of your rental properties into
it depends. It depends on the amount of equity that is in the property.
Mhm.
If they're all at 80% loan to value, and they're not that expensive in terms of the total cost of the property, and you have a customary 30-year or even a 15-year mortgage, the equity does not increase exponentially over time. And so in that case, don't mind grouping them all
Mhm.
into an LLC. The preferred method for any large equity interests would
Mhm.
be, of course, separate properties
Yeah.
in separate LLCs, because that way then you've contained the risk to each LLC. It can be cumbersome.
Mhm.
It can be expensive. But if you've got that step done, and let's just say we have them all in one LLC, then inside that LLC, you need to run it like a business. You need to have a cash account that collects the rents and pays for the mortgage, and it pays for the repairs. And you need to have an operating agreement that says who does what.
Right.
Okay. So in the event that you have one person, usually is the managing member, and they go out and they manage the property, or they hire a management company such as your firm to manage the property for them. There's a separate agreement, but you also need to have a succession plan. You need to have what happens if the managing member becomes incapacitated. There has to be something in writing that says who's allowed to take over and do rent collections, real estate repairs, and so on. So the LLC, as I said, is a hybrid corporate partnership kind of entity.
So the biggest real benefit, I guess, for having that is really the asset protection.
Yes,
Correct?
that is the primary
It's- yeah.
benefit. And there have been some really interesting cases that have come through the office that I can't really discuss in great detail, but somebody who is injured on a piece of real estate
Mhm.
always thinks it's their lottery ticket, and the lawsuits
Yep.
come out, and it becomes a total pain
Yep.
for the person who is the owner. But that's just the kind of vehicle we use for real estate. Now, if you have an estate plan in place and you need a living trust based plan, and that's because you have enough other assets that are not beneficiary designated, such as life insurance or retirement accounts, but you own significant assets, then we would put a revocable living trust in play for you and transfer the membership interest of the LLC to the living trust. Now, all of these transfers have another component to them. If the owner of the LLC is the same as the grantor and beneficiaries of the living trust, there's not a transfer tax. So we need to always look at lender's permission, insurance company's permission, and look at the transfer tax hit to the investor. So the living trust is controlled by the grantor, the person who created it. Sometimes it's a joint trust with husband and wife. They can buy and sell property just as they could before.
Yep.
But it does not insulate them from liability from outside lawsuits. That's why we would have at the top the living trust and underneath it the LLC, and that would flow the income to the grantors. There's another vehicle out there. It's called a land trust.
I was
and
just going to ask you about this because I
Yeah.
was, that comes up too. And that's a way to where people can't really see the ownership. Is that
Correct.
correct? Yeah.
It's like a living trust in that it's revocable and you control it, but it puts a front person up there so that there is a barrier between you and the rest of the world as to who owns this piece of real estate. If somebody wants to do enough investigation, they can find out who the real owner is. So it just puts a few roadblocks in the place in front of the person trying to sue you.
Right.
And oftentimes a land trust is too complicated for the average person who
I was going
has
to say,
maybe.
right. When is that important to use? Is it when you have, this huge portfolio of
Exactly,
properties? Yeah.
exactly. It's not when you have one or two pieces of
Mhm.
rental real estate and that's your retirement game plan down the road, that as the mortgage is paid off and the property appreciates and you have a good tenant and there's a flow of income coming out, that is the average person, and you don't need a land trust. It's just infinitely too complex to
Right.
engage in.
But back to the LLC. So in a situation like that, say for just a regular landlord who owns 1, 2, 3 properties, and you over time start using that as a retirement strategy, that's one of the things I know we're going to do. We have rental property. They're starting to get these mortgages are paid off, and then you have cash flow. But when you yourself then have that much more equity, then it's even more important to put that, to make sure it's part of an LLC.
Correct, correct. The more you have at risk, the more the LLC makes sense. I like to work with clients who have just started doing this so that it's set up properly, it becomes seamless, it becomes their standard operating procedure,
Right.
and they don't really worry about the cost,
Mm-hmm.
because the cost in the long run, if you amortize it over time, is peanuts in comparison to the benefit of preserving your
Right.
assets. So
Right.
to me, that's important. If an LLC doesn't make sense for somebody and they just want to own it directly, then we often will put it into their living trust, and the trustee of the trust who takes over if you become incapacitated has the ability to collect the rents, to evict the tenant, to sue, to do everything that you could do. So it's a question of whether we use an LLC or we use a living trust. I like the LLC better,
Mhm.
and the membership interest goes into the living trust, and therefore the trustee can step in and still do all of these things as the owner.
Okay.
Now, when somebody dies, we have to value the LLC, and that becomes very interesting if you have a stream of income, because there's a stream of income in the LLC,
Mhm.
and then there's the overriding LLC. So if you have two members who own it and the deceased person was a 50% owner, you don't just look at the underlying value of the real estate.
Mhm.
You look to the income stream, and then you look to their ownership interest.
Ah,
So there's lots of ways of valuing this. It's a little more complicated than it should be, but it saves taxes down the road, because when somebody dies, normally the value of the property inherited is whatever the fair market value would be.
right.
But because of liability, we've wrapped this piece of real estate in an LLC. So we
Right.
have two parts that we have to value: the underlying real estate and the running of the business of the LLC.
Okay. So really
So
the bottom line here is, the message here is that if you are going to make real estate and rental properties part of your investment strategy portfolio, you really need to look at all of these and consult with somebody from the get-go so that you do.
absolutely.
Yep. Okay.
Absolutely. This is not a do-it-yourself kind of situation, because
Yeah.
you can miss one of the issues and really hurt your family. Now, if
Yeah.
it's just you and you're alive and you realize your mistake and it can be fixed, it's not a big deal. The
Right.
problem comes about when somebody passes and we can't fix it
Yeah.
easily.
Because I would say, and I don't know the statistics offhand, but I would say a majority of the people own their rental properties in their name. Probably don't have it in an LLC. Probably don't
And
have it in a trust either, or don't have a
and-
trust.
right, and they probably don't have enough insurance on it or
Right.
an umbrella policy to cover themselves,
Right.
because they don't think in terms of litigation. I mean, when somebody comes into my office, we're already at a litigation type situation. So I see this constantly. Um,
Yeah.
you also have to recognize that if they don't have any living trust
Mm-hmm.
and they simply own it outright and they continue along and they die, let's say they have no will,
Mm-hmm.
we have to go into the court, because the court will open probate.
Yeah.
And probate is the only mechanism by which you can transfer ownership of real estate
Right. And that is a long
bank
process.
accounts.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a paperwork nightmare.
Yeah.
as I'm sure you've
Yes.
experienced.
Yes.
So,
Yeah. It's even when things are organized, it can be really complicated. And
yes.
when they're not, it is a real nightmare. Let me get your opinion on real estate and retirement planning.
Okay.
You know, obviously somebody, as you purchase real estate for what, like you said, for whatever, whether it's your primary home, rental property, you need to look at these things and put things in place up front. Do you see many people using rental income to fund elder care, to fund assisted living type of situations? And what do you think of that kind of strategy?
I don't see it as a common plan.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say maybe a quarter of the clients that come in have that as their game plan.
Mm-hmm.
It's good in that you have cash flow. The bottom line, though, is it's real estate, and if there becomes a need for immediate cash, you have a
Mm-hmm.
time delay in terms of liquidating that.
Yeah.
So what I like to see if that's the game plan, that it needs to be supplemented with maybe a life insurance policy that could substitute for long-term health care, because what we're seeing is 1 out of 2 people will need some assistance as they age.
Yeah.
Mobility, cognitive impairment,
Absolutely.
all the other activities of daily living that they have a problem with.
Because I see
And
people sometimes too, Michelle, like people, you know, the children now, they have to put the parent in somewhere, and either they are going to pay the money, you know, if the parent doesn't, or if there's a chance that that property it has no mortgage, you know, so it could become a rental property and could
yes,
help fund that. But again, it has to be, yeah, obviously it isn't liquid, but, and there are, you know, there are pros and cons to each, because yes, if you have a rental property and the kids are
right,
taking it, then you have to maintain it, and that's a whole other ball game.
right.
But it could provide, you know,
It could
ongoing
provide
cash
a
flow.
very, it could provide a very nice cash flow.
Yeah.
The professional that you hire would work with you to determine
Right.
what may be uncovered, because if you end up in a facility, $120,000 a year is a pretty standard cost for
Yeah.
nursing home.
Yeah.
And that's in Northern Virginia, and that's today's dollars. So,
Isn't that like, I mean, the thought of that is just, it's
staggering.
crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, it is staggering. And if you look to go to a Medicaid type planning, the LLC does not protect you from Medicaid attaching that property
Oh.
to recover. So Medicaid is essentially a spend down program.
Mhm.
You can only have $2,000 a month income in Virginia, plus or minus a little bit, and basically no assets. So when we look at a game plan, we look at today,
Mhm.
we look at retirement, and we look at worst case scenario, and try to set it up with all of those end goals in
Yeah.
mind.
Yeah.
But it can be very expensive. So we have to look at what your asset base is, what you can afford to do, and propose plans. But if they're beyond your means, then there's nothing we can do. We can kind of do I think they call it the Hail Mary pass.
Yeah.
I'm not a big football person, but yeah, you end up with a crisis planning at that point. So
Okay. Well, I'm sure most people who are watching this, probably their head is spinning a little bit. I'm sure they've heard bits and pieces of this, but when you think of it all together and really try to determine what do you really need, again, it comes back to just sitting down with somebody. Do you have any, I guess, horror stories or crazy things that you, not without giving detail, but that you can share that would just, you know, those are always the things, as you said, if everything goes fine and if you don't do any of this and you don't have any problems, which is not going to be the case if you own real estate, there always is going to be a problem. It's just a matter of when. Then that's a different story, and but that's not the case. So it's when you hear
well,
things like these kinds of stories, you go, oh my gosh, it creates some urgency in doing this sooner than later.
well, first of all, we have an underlying premise in the law that unless you're declared incompetent, you can make as many crazy decisions as you want, and they can be fiscally irresponsible, and nobody can force you to be fiscally
Okay.
responsible. So we had one case many years ago where there was a medication conflict, and the owner of the piece of real estate felt that it was poisoning them, vacated the residence, left it vacant, and was going from place to place, uh, renting, and at some point in time ended up living out of their car.
Oh,
The family could do absolutely nothing because there were no documents in place for a power of attorney, because by that point in time, this person was so paranoid that they would not sign it. Not only was the power of attorney for finances not in place, but there were no medical powers of attorney in place. And so the property was worth something like $2.5 million. And lack of use on a piece of real estate destroys the plumbing. There were rodents and things of that nature. Another case where siblings did not get along in an estate, and there was a will. The property just went into total disrepair, and when they were finally able to get into the property, it had been so destroyed by animals that it was now, instead of being a habitable, refurbished piece of rental property, it's a tear down special.
Yeah.
So the worst that can happen is all of your good plans, all of your purchases, all of your real estate is harmed by not having a game plan in place. Because the what if, I mean, it doesn't even have to be something such as mental incompetency. It can be an auto accident that puts you temporarily out of play. And let's just say your tenant has decided not to pay, and there's certain protocol that has to be in play for somebody to serve them with, you know, you are past due, please pay the rent, and then bring the lawsuit. You have no documents, you got to go to court, have that person declared incompetent, even if it's a temporary, and preserve the assets.
Yeah. Wow. That sounds horrible.
It is.
But, I mean, I'm sure you have many more stories, and it's, you know, every scenario, like in our, you know, you think, you know, and you've seen a lot of it, but then there's always something else that comes up.
Well, the one thing that people forget about is oftentimes you will buy property, real estate, like your home, as husband and wife, and no powers of attorney in place. Well, if one of you becomes disabled, then it becomes economically not feasible for the survivor or the well person to live in that home. Absent a court order, you can't sell that home just because you're husband and wife.
Wow. Oh, even if you're both
Even if you're both on the title, you both have real estate rights, property rights that you need to give somebody a power of attorney. You need to have a game plan for the LLC.
Yeah.
Lawyers are all about paper.
Yeah.
And you can't go sell somebody's real estate without their permission.
Yeah.
So,
well, those are all like really good things to think about, and I think this is super helpful for all of the landlords watching. I think I'm gonna put what's the best way for people to contact you, and what jurisdictions do you work in?
I'm licensed in Virginia, and I'm also licensed in New York.
Okay.
My associate attorney is licensed in Maryland and DC as well as Virginia. Okay. So we cover the tri-state area.
Okay, good.
I'm physically located in Vienna, Virginia. Yep. And the best way to reach us would be to call the office and ask to speak to me, or my staff can usually handle an early phone call and get it directed to me, or get enough information that we can have a meaningful conversation when I do return the call. Okay. The office number is 703-917-0804.
Yeah, and I will put a link to all of that down in the notes below, so people can reach out to you if they have questions and if you can help them.
Well, I hope I didn't scare you too much and turn you gray, Sue.
Yeah, no, I've heard all this before, but again, like hearing it all together and knowing these layers of things, it's still complicated. And I know we've done parts of this, even we own multiple rental properties. We haven't done it all. And we will be getting more of our stuff in order. And, you know, it's just, you have to continue to revisit it too. You know, things change in your life. I guess that's another big point, that you can't just do it once and then before you know it, it's 10, 15 years later. And, oh, by the way, you've had, you know, more kids, or you've had more, I don't know, everything changes.
More assets, more complexity, health issues. And the thing that's also quite interesting is people will create their game plan. They will sign the documents, but the asset transfers into a trust don't occur, or the asset transfers to the LLC don't occur. Well, the paperwork's there, but it's useless.
Right.
Because you're going to have to go through the court system. And I personally prefer not to have court involvement. Yeah. Because of the time delay and the reporting and the accounting that has to occur in an estate. So I like working with people on a total plan, and some parts of it can be done by you individually,
Yeah,
and other parts require an attorney. And the transfer of real estate into any kind of a entity or to another person
right.
requires an attorney. So,
Well, I think it's like anything, like any professional that, especially in assets that are, this is probably one of the biggest assets people have. Their home,
they're home.
multiple homes, but it's worth it to pay a professional to save you a lot of headache and legal problems down the road.
Yes, and you often don't know. And if you end up
Right.
having minor children or you throw a special needs child into that mix, it's
Yeah.
even more
Yeah.
complicated. So
Yeah.
just go and seek somebody professionally to assist you and have them look at the global picture of your life.
Right.
Who's in it? What do you own? What's your game plan?
Yeah.
Um, I
Good
have
advice.
one client who is in early stages of dementia
Hmm.
and refuses to give up control of the 20 million of real estate that's owned. So
Oh,
it's becoming a problem, and we have to deal with it at
yeah.
that point. But it's
Yeah.
sad.
Yeah, that's a sad, and that's hard.
Yes.
I mean, it's just hard.
Oh
It's
yeah.
life, but you have to, you know.
We do have a little bit of a heart in here, even though we're attorneys. You know, they haven't cut our heart out completely, but
Yes.
we try to give quality service at
You do.
fairly
You know
reasonable
your stuff,
prices.
that we know, and we are happy to send people to you. And I think all this information is really valuable. So I appreciate your time, Michelle. I know you're super busy, and but I think this is great, and I think it would help a lot of people. So
Well, I appreciate
you,
you giving me this
yeah,
opportunity to educate people.
yep. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much,
We'll see
Sue.
you soon. Okay.
Okay,
All
take
right.
care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.